everyone. Welcome. It is so lovely to have all of you here. My name is Haley Schulman, and I am the director of Project Zug. It's a role I came into only a few months ago, back in May. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. It has been a huge pleasure to learn with you all for my very first learning cycle on the Project Zug team. I look forward to learning with you all again in our future learning cycles. Keep an eye out for the next one, which will begin in November, for which registration will open after Yom Kippur. If you want to bring Project Zug in a larger way to your own community, whether that's your synagogue, your JCC, a Jewish organization that you work for or volunteer for, please reach out to me. I will make sure that my email address gets into the chat. I would love to hear from you and collaborate with you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Aliza Abulafia, the Project Zug user coordinator, to say a few words before passing it over to Rabbi Shai Held to teach tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Haley, for that introduction. And Haley's the best. So seriously, take her word for it and bring your community to Project Zug so that we can all do this together. It's good to see so many of you again. My name is Aliza, as I said, and I'm the user coordinator, which means that I try and meet whatever needs you have, whether it's figuring out some sort of tech issue or you're not getting the emails. There's a lot going on. This platform is pretty complicated, and so I'm here to help in whatever way I can. And I also love to hear how your learning is going. So feel free to email me. I'd love to hear what learning at Zug is like for you. So as Haley said, our next learning cycle, the fall learning cycle, starts in November, but registration opens pretty soon. So I'm just going to have, Bachi has the link to the interest form, and which they will at some point drop in the chat. And if you're interested in learning with our fall learning cycle, being matched with a chavruta, bringing your own chavruta, all of our course options will be available, and you can fill out the interest form to be notified when that registration goes live. And aside from that, it's been really wonderful to get a few peeks into your learning this Elul. And before I pass it over to Rabbi Shai Held, I would love to just get us warmed up in the chat. And if you could just post one thing that you learned from your chavruta over the last 4 weeks of learning, one takeaway, maybe something that surprised you or something that was interesting that they said that you would never have gotten to on your own. This platform is all about learning with a chavruta, with a pair. And so we'd love to hear from you something that you learned from your chavruta or with your chavruta or that you came to together. And you can post these throughout the learning if that feels good to you. I'd love to just maybe see a few now. And I really encourage you to just scroll through some of the answers coming in and see the amazing Torah that you've learned from each other over the past month, because that's really what Elul and what Zug is about, growing and learning and being moved by one another. Yeah. So the complexity of teshuvah, digging deep, the role of the bat kol. So keep these coming. And now I'm going to pass it to our teacher for tonight and for the past month of Elul, Rabbi Shai Held, to kick off the lecture.
Thank you so much, Haley and Aliza. Thank you, all of you. It takes a special kind of dedication to come to this class the night before Rosh Hashanah, so really thank you. I hope that you've all enjoyed and been challenged by the learning in this tshuva course. Tonight, I want to think a little bit about a topic that is obviously central to this time of year and to the process of tshuva more generally, which is forgiveness. Fascinating and important though it is, I won't talk tonight about divine forgiveness, the idea of God forgiving us for our sins. I'll focus instead on interpersonal forgiveness, on questions of whether and when, or if you prefer, under what circumstances we are expected to, are capable of, are willing to forgive one another. I obviously am not going to try to offer a fully developed theory of forgiveness. It's interesting, by the way, that there is a burgeoning and exploding discussion among contemporary moral philosophers about just what forgiveness is and isn't. We're not going to go there tonight, although I'm happy to touch on some of that in the Q&A if that comes up. Instead of all that, in the spirit of this course, I want to offer some windows on forgiveness, to probe some of the major questions that arise in thinking about forgiveness, and to offer some very tentative guidance as to how we might approach them. We'll focus tonight first on two biblical narratives, and then we'll move to normative halachic texts, thinking about forgiveness. So I want to begin, and Bachi, when you're ready, you can share. I want to begin with the story of Joseph and his brothers, which is where almost all discussions of forgiveness from a narrative perspective in Judaism begin. And I want to begin with this obvious question. Does Joseph forgive his brothers? Scholars, it's worth saying, are all over the map in interpreting this story, in assessing the character of the various participants in the story, and for that matter, in making sense of the actions that they take. I should, I guess, mention as we get going that some scholars deem the motives of the characters so opaque as to elude analysis, but I don't want to surrender so quickly. Let's assume we can at least say something about the characters in the story and about what drives them. And let's also ask, which I think is crucial to understanding this story, why does Joseph insist on putting his brothers through the proverbial ringer, right? Why does he effectively torture them? Now, in general, it's hard to interpret Joseph's actions because, as a variety of scholars writing on this story note, his behavior is extremely enigmatic. Why doesn't he make any attempt to communicate with his father once he comes to power in Egypt? Why doesn't he reveal his identity to his brothers right away, but instead, as I say, torture them? What is he seeking to accomplish? What is he seeking to do? One possibility, of course, is that he's testing them. Another is that he's conflicted and ambivalently working through his own pain. And a third, of course, is that he's testing them precisely because he's going through a larger process of working through his own ambivalence and pain. Now, let's start with this. How do we know that Joseph is ambivalent? Well, I think the text gives us a very subtle hint, and this requires reading, I think, very slowly and carefully. If you look at source 1, which is Genesis 42, you will notice that in the span of 3 or 4 verses, Joseph begins with one plan. His first thought is to imprison all the brothers except one and to send that one home to bring Benjamin. But then, seemingly due to nothing but his own inner conversation, he changes course, choosing to keep only one brother imprisoned and sending all the rest home. Contrast verses 16 and 19. The narrator, I think, is offering a hint of sorts into Joseph's experience of this whole situation. As Gordon McConville, a contemporary Bible scholar, writes, this may be a moment when Joseph contemplates revenge but thinks better of it and decides upon a strategy of full reconciliation. Whether or not this full reconciliation remains to be seen, but it may very well be that he's struggling right now with whether to take revenge, or perhaps in a more nuanced way, how much revenge to take. In fact, by the way, I think you can make a case that this story is ultimately about not forgiveness, but about overcoming the impulse to take revenge for past hurts. So Joseph is understandably in some degree of anguish. And his brothers, do they feel guilty? I think source 2 provides a window into that question. Again, the narrator doesn't, this is how biblical narrative works. The narrator does not stop and describe emotions. The narrator evokes emotions through the narrative. So when they are describing themselves to Joseph, we are 12 brothers. B'nei ish echad be'eretz Canaan, the children of one man in Eretz Canaan. V'hinei hakatonet avinu hayom, the youngest one is with our father today. And then despite not being prompted at all, they say, v'ha'echad einenu, and one is no more. This is evidence of their guilty conscience. So the story kind of, I think, brings us or hints to us, or gently or softly suggests to us that there's a fair amount of torment on both sides. Joseph can't decide what to do when he's faced with these brothers who have hurt him so deeply, and they clearly are having trouble living with the legacy of what they've done. Now, it's worth stopping to note that nowhere does the text explicitly state that the brothers asked Joseph for forgiveness, or that Joseph granted it to them. Nor, for that matter, does it tell us that Joseph asked for forgiveness for lording it over his brothers, or that they granted it to him. Fascinatingly, by the way, and this is a topic for its own lecture, which I hope to give one day when I have something to say about it, nowhere in Tanakh does any person grant another selicha, or forgiveness. On the contrary, only God is soleach in biblical narratives. It is in itself really interesting and worth contemplating. If you look at source 3, okay, you see that the brothers asked, we'll get to this, but the brothers essentially seemingly lie. When Jacob dies, they make up a story that Jacob sent Joseph a message saying, please, sana, which JPS translates here as forgive the sin of your brothers. Right? Kotomru li Yosef. This is what you should say to Yosef. Ana sana pesha achecha. Right? Forgive, please, the sin of your brothers. This verse is usually taken, if you look at all the various modern academic translations, sana is almost always translated as forgive. But as Joshua Berman of Bar-Ilan University pointed out to me in all places on an exchange on Facebook, sana may actually refer to not punishing rather than to forgiving. And those are obviously not quite the same thing. Of course, one reason one might spare another person punishment for their crimes is that one has forgiven them, but there may be other reasons as well. Interestingly, also, Joseph does not respond to their words in this pasuk. This pasuk is emotionally so interesting. They quote their father saying, please, remit their punishment or forgive them, however you want to translate sana, and Joseph responds by sobbing. No words, no speech, certainly no verbal resolution. But is there something akin to forgiveness in this story, given that there is no explicit request for forgiveness, there is no explicit granting of forgiveness? Is there something akin to forgiveness? What we do have in this story is Joseph dramatically changing his behavior towards his brothers, going from putting them through an extended ordeal to actively comforting them. If you look at source 4, you see, and actually source 4 and source 5, you will see that Joseph is actually trying to comfort them. Actively trying to make them feel that it's all okay. Look, for example, at verse 24, Al tirgezu baderech. Don't get all quarrelsome or battling with each other all along the way. And in source 5, he speaks kindly to them, literally, vayinachem otam vaydaber al libam. He comforted them and spoke to their heart. Okay, so something interesting is going on here. Is this forgiveness? Is this not forgiveness? We'll try to piece that out in just a moment. But there's some form of reconciled feelings on Joseph's part. The brothers, in turn, go from being unable to speak a kind word about him. That is source 6. Vayisneuoto, the end of source 6. The last 6 Hebrew words, Vayisneuoto, velo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They couldn't speak a kind word to him. They go from that to text 7, which is that when he starts crying, the text alluding to itself says, "Va'acharechein dibru echav ito." I would translate that as, and now his brothers finally began to speak to him. So, in other words, whether it's forgiveness or it's not, there is some movement on the part of Joseph towards his brothers and on the part of his brothers towards Joseph. Now, how are we? Actually, let me actually add one thing here, which is that If you look at source 8 for a moment, you will see something that I think is important. Whether or not Joseph has forgiven his brothers, they don't seem confident that he has, right? That is to say, as soon as Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers immediately start saying, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and is going to pay us back for all that we did to him? And then comes that verse that we already saw when they essentially make up a story about Jacob asking him to forgive them. One of the things I think is really interesting here, and we're going to see this in the story of Yaakov and Esau in a little while too, is that I think these narratives make it clear that one of the hardest issues in forgiveness is one that we don't talk about quite as much as we ought to, which is the difficulty of receiving forgiveness. Not just the difficulty of granting forgiveness, but the difficulty of accepting being forgiven. The brothers here immediately, as soon as Jacob dies, as soon as he dies, they're like, oh boy, he must really have it in for us. Whether or not Joseph has forgiven them, they don't seem to betray any indication that he's softened towards them at all, despite how kindly he's spoken to them repeatedly. Okay? So how are we to assess this story? What sense can we make of this? So I want to quote from one Bible scholar who says, although brotherhood and reconciliation are a key theme of this story, there is no simple resolution in these terms. Jacob and Joseph continue to manifest their old character faults, and rather than resolution, the story exhibits the difficulties in the way of reconciliation among brothers. Now, one thing that I personally have come to find helpful, I would say, in this story is precisely its elusiveness. And that's for this reason. The question, have you forgiven me, may sometimes, I'm tempted to say often, I'm actually tempted to say almost always, but I'm not sure I should. The question, have you forgiven me, may be too complex a question to pose as a simple yes or no. Sometimes we may be tempted to say that parts of us are forgiven and parts of us have not. Part of me thinks, it's really okay, I've let go of the wounds. Part of me is 6 years old and is still seething with rage at the things you did to me. And so there's a simplistic way I find we sometimes talk about forgiveness. Have you forgiven me or not? But I wonder whether the story of Joseph and his brothers is in part a way of indicating that that question doesn't help us. It's far too simple. Have you begun the process of forgiving me? Have you begun to move towards me in some way? Has reconciliation at least dawned inside of you? Something like that, which I think is a richer and more complicated question. Forgiveness is often complex and multifaceted. Sometimes, at least, it's not a decision in a moment, but a process that unfolds over time. Ask yourself whether you think of forgiveness as something you sit down and do one day, or the kind of thing that happens as a process, so much so that sometimes you wake up and realize, oh, I think I forgave you. And you're not even sure exactly when and fully how it happened. There's something else about this story, too, that I think is helpful. All the worldly accomplishments in the world don't necessarily wipe away the ensconced hurts from long ago. Joseph is quite literally on top of the world. He has everything anyone could possibly want. But external changes don't necessarily undo internal pain. A process is still needed. When Joseph sees his brothers, he is in part still a wounded teenager and not the vice regent of Egypt. And I think that that's also, really important to keep in mind, and we'll come back to that later. Also, notice the difference between sources 9 and 10. In source 9, Joseph says to his brothers, don't feel bad. Do not criticize yourselves. Ki machartem oti, that you sold me, Heina, to hear. Ki lamichya shlachani Elohim lifnechem, because God was the one who sent me here before you in order to preserve life. But then, after Jacob dies, he says something that seems a little bit different, right? You intended me harm, but God took what you did and turned it for the good. In other words, in Genesis 45, source 9, you have here seemingly a picture of reconciliation. Don't worry, you didn't do anything. It was really God all along. And then after Jacob dies, as Joel Kaminsky points out, the rift resurfaces. Right? Oh, you did bad, but God undid your bad. Do people understand the distinction I'm making? Give me a nod. The first is you didn't do anything. God did it. The second is you did do something, but God fixed it. And what I want to just sort of observe here is something that I think we all know, but all could stand to be reminded of, which is that not all healing is linear and smooth. Sometimes, at least, partial reconciliation should be embraced for what it is and not rejected for what it isn't. It's easy to reject partial reconciliation by saying, this is not the healing I wanted. This is not everything has been worked through. Yes, but this is something, and something is often a lot more than nothing. And I wonder here whether there's something important also about, and the linearity piece is important too, because, if you're the kind of person who has ever woken up on the 11th of Tishrei and felt, I still carry around a lot of rage. I guess yesterday was a failure, right? Then the realization that it isn't in fact linear. The process goes up and down. Many of us have had experiences of thinking we've forgiven someone and then running into them and realizing, oh, I didn't think that you would elicit this from me. And yet that doesn't mean there's no forgiveness. It just means that forgiveness is less than linear. Finally, about this story, from my perspective at least, and I said this before, but I want to just underscore it because it will lead us into the Yaakov and Esau story. Granting forgiveness may be hard, but accepting forgiveness may be just as hard and sometimes maybe even harder. Joseph's brothers have an incredibly difficult time accepting his forgiveness, just as I think, as we'll see in a moment, Yaakov has a difficult time accepting Esau's forgiveness. In source 7 that you saw already, he cries on them, but they only speak to him. And I think that there is something there that is really worth thinking about. We won't kind of dwell on this now, but exactly what is this in this lack of parallel between their reactions? He cries and they speak. It's almost like they can't fully take in the forgiveness that he's offering. Okay. Now, more briefly, moving backwards in the narrative to Jacob and Esau. Now, I want to make the following observation about Esau that I'm guessing is not new to many of you, but I want to at least make it. If you were raised in a traditional Jewish setting in which Esau is portrayed as a villainous character, it can be very hard to actually allow the text of Genesis itself to speak to you. Because the text of Genesis itself, I think, actually sees Esau as a little hapless, but basically a good guy, and the Bible's forgiveness hero. Esau is the paradigm of a forgiveness hero, whereas Cain kills the brother he's jealous of, Esau forgives the brother he's jealous of. And there's something there that's a lot to say. Okay? So let's just think about this for a minute. I brought you much of Genesis 33 here, which we don't have time to read at any great length together, but I want to just point out a couple of things. If you look at verse 4, it says, Vayarotz Esav likrato vayichabkeu, and Esav ran towards Jacob and hugged him. Vayipol al tzavaro, and he fell upon his neck. Vayishakehu vayivku, and he kissed him, and they cried. Notice here that Esav initiates the kissing. Josh Berman also has suggested that the kiss is what suggests forgiveness in biblical narrative, right? And if that's right, then the text is describing Esav as the one forgiving Jacob here, because he's the one who does the kiss. And then in verse 9, he says wonderfully in refusing his brother's vast offerings of gifts, Vayomer Esav yesh li rav, and Esav said, I have enough, right? Yehi lecha asher lach, let what is yours be yours. In talking about Joseph, I observed that sometimes the blessings of the present are not enough to overcome the wounds of the past. Esav, I think, is a suggestion that sometimes evidently they are. Esav realizes his life is full of bracha after all, and he doesn't need to nurse and nurture grudge and grievance against his brother. Sometimes, but not always, the gifts of the present seem to make the wounds of the past seem less intense. And then, as I already indicated, and I think this is really, in my reading at least, the crux of this story, granting forgiveness is hard, receiving it again can be just as hard and harder. Chazal notwithstanding, as I've said, Esau is the hero of this story, but Jacob cannot quite receive what Esau is only too willing to give him. And this story ends in what I think is one of the most poignant and painful moments of the story. Esau wants to travel with Yaakov. Yaakov essentially tells him, go home and I'll meet you there, and then goes in a different direction. And what I find so painful about this story is it is one last deception in a life full of deceptions on Yaakov's part. It's so painful. He essentially tricks his brother Esau. But rather than see this as part of Jacob's troubling or problematic character, I think what we see here is actually that Jacob cannot quite believe that Esau truly wants to live in peace with him, that receiving forgiveness is incredibly, incredibly difficult for him. And that comes out again. Notice how biblical narrative works. The Bible talks explicitly about none of this. It talks implicitly about all of this. And the Joseph story and the Jacob story are both very much narratives that open up the complexity of dynamics around questions of forgiveness, giving it, receiving it, the partiality of forgiveness, the ways that the present can heal the past, but doesn't always heal the past. An awful lot of what we struggle with, I think, in forgiveness and what we might bring to friends or therapists or clergy are brought forward in this text in quite subtle ways. Okay, now let's shift gears now and think a little bit about normative texts about forgiveness. There is a dominant mainstream presentation of the Jewish ethics of forgiveness. And I think it's basically this. One is obligated to forgive when and only when the offender asks for forgiveness. I think it is almost a truism in Jewish culture that if a person hasn't apologized to me, I have no obligation to forgive them. So, for example, the Mishnah in Bava Kama, which is the classical source for this, says, right, that even though a person gives monetary compensation to one whom he has shamed, a kind of a knas, right, a fine, he is not forgiven until he explicitly asked for forgiveness from him whom he has shamed. As it is written, God telling Avimelech that Avraham is a prophet and Avraham will pray on his behalf. And the way the Mishnah reads the story is that Avimelech is going to be, the assumption is that Avimelech is going to ask Abraham for forgiveness for having taken his wife from him. And then Abraham will forgive him. And that forgiveness will be expressed in his willingness to pray wholeheartedly to God on Avimelech's behalf. And then goes on to say, from where do we derive the principle that he who is called upon to forgive should not be hard-hearted? By the fact that Abraham went ahead and did just that. Now, this text alone leaves many questions unanswered. There may be no requirement to forgive someone who does not apologize, but is it desirable to do so? Is it, for that matter, permissible to do so? The Mishnah doesn't answer those questions. But here's the thing that is so striking. So this Mishnah is the paradigmatic, you might say, Jewish teaching about forgiveness. If someone apologizes, you forgive them. But the Tosefta, the text from the same period as the Mishnah, reads the very same biblical story to reach an antithetical conclusion. So listen to this, okay? The Tosefta says, one who injures his fellow, even though the one who did the injury did not seek forgiveness from the injured party has to seek mercy for him. Since it says, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech. Now just notice this. The same biblical story is being read in these two parallel rabbinic texts in two dramatically different ways. According to the Mishnah, what matters is that Avimelech asked for forgiveness, and therefore Abraham forgave him. According to the Tosefta, Abraham and we should forgive regardless of whether or not Avimelech, or the person who has hurt us, has asked us to. Note, by the way, because I think this is kind of poignant, that in both texts, what is spoken of is a letting go of resentment to the point where I can pray sincerely on behalf of a person who has hurt me. That's the sign of forgiveness, when I can say, please God bless him, and not say, please God bless him, that schmuck, or whatever horrible formulation you want to use. Forgive me for that, colorful formulation. So now, if someone says to you, what is the rabbinic teaching on forgiveness? Do you have to forgive someone when they have asked for forgiveness? Or do you have to forgive someone whether or not they have asked for forgiveness? The answer is, it's complicated. So how should we think about these two very different strands of Jewish thought? One, the Mishnah that says when they ask for forgiveness. Two, the Tosefta that says, no, even if they haven't asked for forgiveness. Here, I want to acknowledge that what I'm about to say, I'm indebted to Professor Louis Newman, who I think has written very beautifully about this Mishnah and the Tosefta. The Mishnah, according to Newman, is what happens when we see the world through the lens of justice. The Tosefta is what happens when we see it through the lens of mercy. If our primary perspective on the world is the lens of justice, i.e. in the Mishnah, then forgiving someone who has not attempted to make amends is misguided at best and perhaps even dangerous at worst. In forgiving someone who has made no effort to fix what they did, we upend the moral structure of things. We undermine the social order. A deed is supposed to have consequences, and if you don't do anything to undo or heal what you did through your deed, I have no business forgiving you. Deeds need to have consequences, or else there is no moral order to speak of. If you want to be forgiven, in other words, there are things you have to do first in order to make that possible. That is what it's like to see the world through the lens of justice. But if we move to the Tosefta, if our primary perspective on the world is the lens of mercy, then forgiveness is something we will be willing to grant much more freely than if we see the world through the lens of justice. We may not only be willing to give it, we may be actively eager to do so. Why? Since we believe that God sees the world from the perspective of mercy, we too strive to see it that way. And if you look at source 14, you'll see a midrash that says that forgivingness is a form of the imitation of God, is a form of the halachta b'drakav, of walking in God's ways. Just as God is forgiving to crimes against God, so also should we be forgiving of crimes against us. Now, just to nuance this a little, isn't God also committed to justice? The answer, I think, is yes, although there's a but, which is, I think it's fair to say that for the sages of the Talmud, the aspect of God's relationship to the world we are supposed to emulate and embody is God's kindness and mercy, chesed and rachamim, more than God's justice. Chazal never say, Mahu dayan afatahe dayan, just as God is a judge, so should you be a judge. But they do say, Mahu chanun, just as God is gracious and generous, so should you be. Our relationship to others, in other words, is supposed to be a reflection of God's relationship to us. Just as God treats us with mercy, so are we supposed to treat others with mercy. So at this point, if you have a certain cast of mind, you're tempted to say, well, which one is it? The Mishnah or the Tosefta? Justice or mercy? So is it justice, and so no forgiveness without apology? Or is it mercy, and so unconditional forgiveness? The answer, I think, should be clear, right? Judaism is not about justice or mercy. It's about justice and mercy. So it is in part, I think, about living with the tension and finding our way on a case-by-case and sometimes even moment-by-moment basis. How hard is it to decide between justice and mercy? Well, right now, we come up against the liturgy of the Yamim Noraim, of the days we're about to experience, where the sages essentially say that God struggles with which chair to sit on, The throne of justice or the throne of mercy? There is no more profound Jewish way of saying that something is so hard as to be almost impossible to figure out than to say that even God is struggling with it. Even God has a hard time deciding which throne to sit on. So with these two texts juxtaposed, I think, what Judaism gives us is not an answer, but better language for the question. Or if you prefer, two poles to move between. I often like to say religion for adults, I think, is less about answers than it is about better language for questions. Now, one more interesting point about all this is that it is customary to say, oh, Judaism believes you forgive those who apologize to you. Christianity believes in unconditional forgiveness. But as so often, when people make these like starkly reified contrasts between Judaism and Christianity, it's worth saying that Anthony Bash, one of the most prominent contemporary Christian theorists of forgiveness, basically says, of course you don't forgive someone who doesn't apologize. That would upend the moral order. And Daniel Statman, an Israeli philosopher, argues, what do you mean? According to Judaism, of course you forgive unconditionally. And so the notion that Judaism says X and Christianity says Y on this point, I think is deeply problematic. Judaism has people who say X and Y, and so does Christianity, because they're both struggling on some level with these questions, with similar questions about what it means to live a human life and what it means to live a life that is in some sense reflective of God's own commitments. So with that, I want to shift to another piece of the halachic discussion about forgiveness. Let's turn to source 15, okay? We look here in the Rambam. In Mishneh Torah, the Rambam essentially says in Hilchot Tshuva that there are two obligations: to ask for forgiveness, and second of all, to grant forgiveness when it's sincerely asked from us. But then, okay, and that we know, and we've seen that already, apologizing and granting. But then, if you look at source 16, you see something really interesting, which is in Hilchot Deot, in the laws of character development. The Rambam introduces what I want to call the third obligation. And here's what he says. When a person sins against another, lo yistimenu v'yishtok, you shouldn't hate them and keep silent. But rather, I'm skipping a little bit, right? It is ela mitzvah alav lehodio v'lomarlo. It is his duty to inform the offender and to say to him, Lama asita li kach v'chach? Why did you do this to me? V'lama chatata li bidvar ploni? Why did you sin against me in this manner? Right? And thus it is said, Shene'emar hocheach tochich et amitecha. You must surely rebuke your neighbor. Okay? Now, this is really interesting. We have here, again, as we've seen, the obligation to apologize, the obligation to forgive. But what about this third obligation? So apologize, forgive, and then also tell someone that they need to apologize. What makes this so hard, and what makes it, I would say, not applicable in every circumstance, is that it is an act of profound vulnerability to tell someone who has hurt you that they've hurt you and ought to apologize. And I think we ought to be careful here, because there are situations in human life that the Rambam may not be thinking of where you don't want to put someone in that situation of returning to a position of vulnerability. But that's what it takes in general to tell someone that they've hurt you is an act of vulnerability. And what I want to draw your attention to in the Hebrew, which I think is really interesting, and I don't know whether it's purposeful in Maimonides, is that you can read the Hebrew, you can read the English the same way. I'm not trying to focus specifically on the Hebrew. You can read the words in two very different tones. One is, why did you do this to me? Why did you sin against me in this manner? And the other is, why did you do this to me? Why did you sin against me in this way? In other words, the second one is not berating, but it's asking. And one of the things that perhaps makes forgiveness possible is understanding what the other person was going through when they behaved poorly. Right? In other words, telling a person that they've hurt you And asking them why they did it is a way of opening the door inside oneself to the possibility of forgiveness, because compassion inside of us can be elicited. Now, I want to end this discussion of Maimonides by sharing with you a conversation I once had with my then boss, Dr. Bernie Steinberg, when I was a rabbi at Harvard Hill and Bernie was the Hill director. I mentioned to him in a supervisory meeting that someone on staff had said something that I found incredibly hurtful. And I said, yeah, but I'll judge him l'chaf zchut. I'll judge him favorably and just not say anything. And without skipping a beat, Bernie said, how about you judge him favorably enough to believe that if you told him, he'd apologize? And I feel like there's something very beautiful about that the Rambam may have in mind too. Give people in the benefit of the doubt that they might actually apologize. Now, are there situations where you know someone won't apologize? Yes, there are. I don't think that these principles can be applied to every possible circumstance. I'm not suggesting that, but that there is something very wise about many of our encounters here, I think, is nevertheless the case. Now, one final point I want to share, and then I'll open the floor. I want to talk a little bit about a question that I get asked a lot when I have either given drashot or taught about forgiveness. And it's about the relationship between forgiveness on the one hand and reconciliation on the other. What's the relationship between forgiving someone and fully reconciling with them? There is a fascinating divide. Psychologists tend to distinguish, often sharply, between forgiveness and reconciliation. They argue that it's crucial to do that because that distinction enables people to forgive deceased offenders with whom they cannot reconcile, as well as consistent abusers with whom they should not reconcile. In contrast, when Christian philosophers write about forgiveness, they tend to emphasize the purportedly inextricable link between forgiveness and reconciliation. Some have suggested that that's because when God forgives in the Bible, God does so in the hopes of reestablishing relationship with Israel. Since we're supposed to emulate God's ways, we too should pursue reconciliation. So who's right, psychologists or Christian philosophers? And how should we think and feel our way through this messy set of questions? When some Christian theologians talk about forgiveness, they dismiss and at times are actively disdainful of the idea that forgiveness can be real without reconciliation. They argue that the very idea of forgiveness without reconciliation is meaningful only in a highly secularized, self-help obsessed culture. But religion is about relationships, they say. And so forgiveness and reconciliation should not, cannot be teased apart. I'd like to suggest that they're wrong and to offer what I hope is helpful religious language for thinking about why. Judaism believes deeply in freedom, both external political freedom and internal subjective freedom. As Hasidic masters emphasize again and again and again, liberation is one of Judaism's goals. Liberation from political oppression, yes, but also liberation from memories and traumas and voices and demons that oppress and enslave us. Freedom is therefore, in Jewish spirituality, not only a political aspiration, it's also a spiritual project to free ourselves from our personal Egypts. If freedom is a legitimate aspiration, if God wants us to be free, then forgiveness might well be a goal even when reconciliation is not possible or desirable, or for that matter, when we find it unconscionable. Here's the paradox. If we take Judaism's vision of the good life seriously, then there is no such thing as purely intrapersonal as opposed to interpersonal forgiveness. That is, there's no such thing as forgiveness that is purely internal. Why? Because when I forgive people who have hurt me, even if I never reconcile with them, again, even if I should not reconcile with them, I am freed thereby to connect ever more deeply with other people. Yes, forgiveness does offer the hope of subjective internal liberation, but it also makes deeper relationships possible. If I forgive my ex-husband for his infidelities, then I am free to love and trust my next partner more deeply. If I forgive my mother for what she inflicted on me, then I am free to love my own children more fully and with less chance that I will pass on my own traumas to them. For some of us, the hurts are so deep that forgiveness may not be the right word. And as we saw in the Mishnah earlier tonight, one could argue that in some circumstances, forgiveness is not even appropriate. So maybe for those circumstances, I can offer a simpler, less loaded term, putting down. If my freedom is a value, if it is not simply a given, but rather must be pursued, nurtured, cultivated, if my freedom is a value, then putting down the hurts of the past may be what I need to do in order to be free. And again, in order to enter into relationships with other people more deeply, more fully, more wholly. Again, not just to be free, although that too has inherent value, but also in order to be able to love more deeply and more truly. Thank you very much, and Shana Tova. Bachi, Haley, Aliza, one of you, I will leave it to you to sort of steer the questions here. I don't know who's up for that, but is nobody stepping up here? What's happening? Aliza.
Yeah. Oh, I don't really. Yes. There's been a really vibrant conversation happening in the chat, which I've really been enjoying following. And I'm seeing if I can link any of the questions together, but yeah, I loved what you said at the end, and I think that Ariella's question at 8:01 p.m. actually has a lot to do with what you were saying at the end, and maybe you can link this to your answer will cover some of the other questions. But they write, maybe Jacob can forgive Esau, yet cannot trust him. Does forgiveness always mean that we must trust fully again if someone has wronged us? I don't necessarily think this is like a question that has an answer, but maybe you have some thoughts about it.
Well, yeah. Sorry. It's interesting because if I heard the question correctly, the person wrote that maybe Jacob can forgive Esau. I'm not sure that Esau owes an apology to Jacob for anything. Meaning, I feel like that story is actually about the reverse, which is, can Esau forgive Yaakov rather than Yaakov forgive Esau? I think it is the case, though, if we leave that story behind and move instead just to the general point, I think the question of being forgiving without being a fool is a value, right? That is to say, there are times when you can say, I forgive someone, but I'm not going to make myself vulnerable to let them do that to me again. Now, some people might say, well, then that's not really forgiving. Other people might say that's forgiving in a wise, worldly wise kind of way. I have some sympathy for that second possibility. I don't know, Eliza, you can tell me if you think I misunderstood that question, but that's at least what I would begin to say. Other questions that came up. There's some hands up.
It looks like Ariella wants to follow up on their question, which I think we should. Yeah, Bachi, you can go ahead.
I could be confusing part of the story, but I thought that once Esau's birthright was taken away, or the incident happened with Jacob and the trickery, that Esau threatened Jacob's life and basically said, hunt him down. I want to make sure he's killed, and I believe Jacob would still remember that. So I think my thought was that they both had to forgive each other. Jacob had to believe that Esau no longer wants to kill him and trust that.
Interesting. Okay, so that's an interesting reading of the story. What Esau actually says is that when my father dies, I will kill him. Esau, who clearly loves Yitzchak, will not kill Yaakov while his father is alive. Now that's interesting. If you think that means that Yaakov is supposed to forgive Esau, it's possible. It's possible. I hear what you're saying. It seems to me that the dynamic of that story is primarily, when Jacob sees Esau coming, and this is, I think, very hard to say, is his primary reaction, oh, Esau is a monster and he'll kill me if I don't placate him? Or is he also feeling incredibly guilty? Oh, Esau hates me and he's right. I don't know how to answer that question. And again, biblical narratives don't fill in that kind of detail for us. But I understand better now what you're saying. And I hear you that it's possible they both felt that. I don't really see from Jacob any indication that he feels he's owed an apology. But I hear you. I think you're saying something quite interesting, and I need to process that a little bit.
We have two questions
Okay.
that are from hands. So I think that would be great if we could get those. So Adolfo, I saw your hand first, and then Mona will be second.
So this is all, the way I hear it, this is all about rebuilding broken relationships, right? And, you know, I have to share an insight from my Havruta, and I have to give credit to Josh Milstein because, you know, he did the heavy lifting. So we were talking about mercy, and I was telling him, well, you know, mercy is a word for me that means, well, when I was in elementary school and I was bending the kid's hand and he would say, oh, mercy, you know, to get me to stop. I don't have very many other, you know, associations with that word. And Josh said, wait a second, let's look back at the text. And I said, oh, is it rachamim? And he said, yeah, it is. And then he said, well, there's rechem, which is a womb, right? In which, you know, the fetus is, and to me, and then we talked about that relationship between the mother and the child, right? They share everything, right? And maybe that is what mercy is, this relationship that just is so whole, right? In sharing things, you know, emotions. I mean,
I think that, okay, so let me observe here that the connection you're making between, let me say this carefully, two separate roots, Resh Chet Mem, that means mercy, and Resh Chet Mem from a different root that means womb. That connection has been made both in traditional Jewish commentary, I think if I remember correctly, by Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and also by a variety of feminist Bible scholars. I don't think it's sustainable as philology. I don't think the word for rachamim comes from rechem, but I think there is a beautiful pun to be made there. And in all honesty, who cares that it's not the pshat of the philology? I mean, it's fine, but like there's something very beautiful there about appealing to the maternal generosity, maternal givingness, maternal bonding, all of that in the context of mercy. I think that there's a lot of beautiful midrashic possibility there. Again, I don't think it's sustainable as the meaning of the Hebrew word, but I'm not sure how much that should matter to anyone who's not, you know, invested in the philology of ancient Hebrew. There are people on this call who are deeply invested in the philology of ancient Hebrew, and you know, I think your point is very beautiful, and there is a lot to say there. Mona, go ahead. Bachi, if we could, perfect, thank you.
Hi, this has been fabulous, and I really appreciate it. I just want to say that there's a pretty significant psychological literature on forgiveness, and much of it, I think, has been influenced by the Christian view of unilateral forgiveness, which is the belief that we should forgive because Christ forgave our sins, right? That's the Christian view. And I know you said it's more complicated than that, but there's a lot of work on that basically it's a free gift, basically, you give, independent of whether the offender has done teshuvah. And by contrast, there's a beautiful book by Janice Spring called How Can I Forgive You? The Courage to Forgive, the Freedom Not to, in which she lays out a really much more dyadic view of forgiveness. And what she says is that genuine forgiveness is really what Rambam is saying, right? That the offender does take stock and makes amends and apologizes and promises not to do it again. And then the forgiver needs to forgive. But what if your offender hasn't the courage, or is dead, or is drunk, or is unable, mentally ill, and unwilling to do the work?
That's
what
a
do you do?
personality disorder that will never allow them to apologize. Right.
So then what do you? Then you're stuck, right? And the other thing that the literature in psychology has shown is that Non-forgiveness, i.e. chronic anger, really eats away at your health. It wrecks your immune system. It can set you up for cardiac problems. It's very, very destructive physically and psychologically. So what do you do if your offender won't make amends? And she lays out a system of what you can do. You can hold on to non-forgiveness, which will probably kill you. You can forgive what she calls cheap forgiveness, which is really, I think, unilateral forgiveness, which is, I'm going to forgive you, but maybe my offender hasn't, maybe my abuser hasn't done any work, and so I could be in really trouble by forgiving. And then she lays out a fourth option, which is acceptance, that the person may not be available to do the work, but I can, exactly what you said, put down the burden of anger and find a way to get on with my life and acknowledge that my offender is limited. I may or may not reconcile. That's a separate issue, as you said. But I don't have to be angry forever. And I think it's just a very elegant way of looking at this from a much more Jewish point of view than most of the psychological literature.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I mean, yeah, I have a friend who's a therapist who always likes to say, anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die, which is, I think, a totally wonderful formulation. I think there's a lot to what you said. There's a book that just came out that's on my desk that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, by Everett Worthington, who's one of the most well-known psychologists researching forgiveness. And this book is about the question that I think many people struggle with, which is, if I forgive someone, does that suggest that what they did to me wasn't unjust? How do you struggle with the fear that if I say I forgive you, I'm saying that what you did wasn't that bad? Whereas, in fact, what you're trying to say in forgiveness, no, what you did was so bad that it requires forgiveness. But it gets very messy and very confused. I've seen this in counseling situations many times, and those of you who are therapists, I'm sure have seen it many more times than I have, but just how psychologically confusing it becomes for adults, for example, to try to forgive things that happened to them as children. It is often so vexed, I find, so complex, so many contradictory feelings and impulses. So yes, I think there's a lot to say there. And I'll tell you, I want to be honest and say that when I was preparing this lecture, I was really struggling with the ways in which I feel like all these lectures require, this topic requires almost like a constant willingness to say, and yet there are cases that are so extreme that I'm not sure any of this really applies. This is a terrible way to end, but I'm walking myself into a little bit of an abyss here. But I will tell you about the single craziest counseling experience I have ever had. I had a young woman come to see me, a high school student, whose father was in prison for murdering her mother. And her father was sending her letters from jail saying, "I think you really ought to forgive me because Christ has." And she, sobbing in my office, was like, what am I supposed to do with these letters? Right? And I remember thinking, like, okay, so this is where like all these categories become extraordinarily hard to apply, right? First of all, using theology as a form of manipulating one's own child, right? One has robbed one's child of, like, one of your parents is dead and the other one is a murderer. Like, what do you say in these situations? And I want to acknowledge this because some of us carry burdens that others of us can scarcely imagine, of things that were said to us, of things that were done to us, of violence that we suffered through. And so I just sort of want to acknowledge that I think there's like a lot of wisdom here for a lot of circumstances. And then there's situations that it's very hard to know just how to apply the wisdom of these texts to. I do think there is something really important about, what I called, and Mona just sort of amplified, is this notion of putting down. That there is something really important there. And I do think that there are situations where there are people who the word forgiveness feels impossible to them, but putting down or accepting might feel more within reach. So if this topic for you raises, oh my God, you cannot even imagine what I carry, my first reaction is, I'm incredibly sorry, and I know what I have some deep sense of what that's like. And also to ask whether there's anything in this discussion that is nevertheless helpful, applicable, a place for some softening. I think that there is a lot here. I'm sorry I can't be more eloquent about this or articulate about it, but I think that there's just something enormously important here. And I just sort of felt like I couldn't end tonight without saying, yeah, there are people for whom what they've been through is so extreme that we have to nuance this language and maybe realize that it just doesn't apply in any direct way, the way it might in an interpersonal breach of, you know, I said something and Mona was insulted and then we worked it out. We're talking about things that are much, much more extreme and painful than that. So I want to just invite us, you know, to think about what are the ways in which we could grant forgiveness in the days to come? What are the ways that we could ask for forgiveness in the days to come? And what are the ways that we could accept forgiveness? Forgiveness that may have been offered to us a long time ago, but we've never been able to make fully our own and to take on board. I said tonight that I wanted to offer windows on forgiveness to open discussions rather than close them. And I hope we've done that. And I thank you all for the last month of learning. And I wish all of us a year filled with sweetness, love, and hey, it can't be worse than it was last year. So let's have a good year coming up. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shai Held, for the learning for the whole month and also those ending words. Thank you so much, all of you who came tonight and who learned and joined our learning community. I hope that you'll come back and keep learning with us. We do this all year round. And I'm just gonna drop the interest form for our fall learning cycle into the chat one more time and say good night. So Bachi, if you could hit the music, and then we'll say good night. Thank you, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Shana
I'll end the
Tova.
meeting for us all. Bye.